this subject is changing so quickly in real time as we walk up to the most unprecedented election, I think, maybe in the history of this country, taking place amidst a stack of Category 5 news events between the pandemic and the economic crisis and the social upheaval, and now, the western edge of the country burning down. It really brings home, I think, why it is not just that democracy all too often now feels like a battleground, but why information may be the critical battleground of the 21st century. I don't see how democracy functions without public trust and mutual tolerance and good faith arguments, all of which are plainly at risk. I'm going to offer you something of my unified field theory of the challenges to democracy, and that everything is connected, including many of the things that you all pointed to of what you think the problems are. And what I want to tease out are some of the interconnections here. So you'll see in this graphic that I feel like that big circle undermining, the thing that has really, in a way, changed most dramatically, most recently, is the collapse of the business model for media. And this is important because even though the press is the only constitutionally protected industry in America, it is also a business. And when the model for that business collapses, that has implications for everything that journalists are supposed to do. So this is what that looks like in a nutshell, basically. If you look at this chart, you can see how profitable newspapers were. That's that blue line from the 1950s all the way through the second half of the 20th century, peaking in around 2000, $67 billion in advertising revenue. And then it just falls off a cliff as Google and Facebook come sweeping in and become, dramatically more effective at reaching clients. And serving advertisers because of their data, because of their ability to very, very efficiently deliver messages to consumers. This is not the first time that media has been disrupted. Traditionally, it was a very profitable business all through the 20th century. It would be periodically blown up by new competition from radio to TV to print to cable to internet. I got to live through the end of the glory days for what we think of as mainstream media and the arrival of the apocalypse. But the 21st century, the fact that that the press is still a business by and large, and that it faces an extinction level event has, I think, profoundly affected its ability to play that critical public role. The rise of social platforms in the last 10 years has changed so utterly how people get information. And I don't think we have even begun to process this. So what happens then? Well, it is against that backdrop that we have to think about trust. Why trust? Well, because these last 6 months have been something of a serial failure of institutions that in many cases, Americans at least, had placed enormous trust in, including ones like the CDC, the FDA, the WHO, and because of things that we did not know at the time about how COVID spreads and the risk of asymptomatic spread, and because of their legitimate concern for having masks be available to healthcare workers, you ended up having not just the WHO, but the Surgeon General and Anthony Fauci urging people, you don't have to worry about wearing masks. You would think that that is not a problem, that as understanding evolved, as we all learned more about this pandemic, it's a novel coronavirus, there was a lot we didn't know, that it would be possible to have guidance evolve and to not have the trust in these institutions be compromised just because their guidance in March and April had evolved by May and June. Unfortunately, that is not the environment that we're operating in. That the whole notion of the scientific method and of testing hypotheses and being able to refine your thinking is not at all well suited to the environment that we find ourselves in. Once we don't have a shared body of fact to consult, once we have polarized into all of our different political identities so completely, it means that betraying your tribe comes at too high a cost, even on matters where arguably your life depends on it. Success in this world, in a polarized world, is much more about talking about emotion and outrage than actually solving problems and finding compromise. And so the problems get worse, which means trust in institutions declines even further, and you get this vicious cycle of declining trust and increasing polarization feeding on each other. And then remember, because it's all one story, the business crisis, where I would argue, it's my bias, that Facebook has done as much as anyone to destroy the business model of the press and to profit from algorithms that favor emotion and feed outrage and profit by feeding the forces of division and misinformation, so that you now get, this is the ultimate polarization, is the number of COVID deaths acceptable or not acceptable? And look at the difference in what Republicans say, what Democrats say, what independents say. That is what polarization looks like. We are here literally talking about life and death. And we can't even agree on what counts as an acceptable number of deaths. Once the response to the pandemic became part of people's partisan identity, the odds of public health success just plummeted. This is the calculation. Do you have more to lose from being cast out of your tribe or from getting a disease that you've led to believe is exaggerated by the media in order to undermine your leader? At that point, refusing to wear a mask becomes not just an expression of liberty, which was one framing for it, but a sort of condensed signal of opposition to progressive technocrats who want to tell people what to do. So once you have a polarized public that does not trust institutions, you have now created the perfect conditions for misinformation. You've got the business incentives to spread it, you've got the high polarization that invites people to believe it, and you've got the low institutional trust that fails to act as a counterweight. And now you have the kind of environment in which dangerous disinformation can spread most quickly. This is the combined market cap of Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple, just those four, which is bigger than the gross domestic product of 190 other countries. That represents a kind of economic power that I don't think there's a precedent for. One of the major projects at the Shorenstein Center in the last 2 years has been led by Tom Wheeler, former SEC chair, about how to think about regulating the platforms and what that will look like. And they've just published their paper about the need for how would you design a digital regulatory agency to start to have a kind of nimbleness and enforcement power to address the extraordinary power of these platforms. I think it's a challenge to policymakers and to us as individuals, how we think about them as a force for good and a potentially destructive force to these democratic values is hugely challenging, hugely important.